Renfield is a very interesting character in Dracula. He is an inmate at a lunatic asylum, which happens to be located right next to Carfax, the property that Dracula purchased in London. And so the proximity of Renfield to Dracula, that physical proximity, becomes very symbolic in a number of ways. The influence that Dracula has on those around him is in large part psychic and telepathic. And so in some instances, for example, this is why Mina and Lucy are attracted to him and receptive to him in ways that the men are not. Jonathan Harker is also receptive to Dracula's telepathy because he is so feminized. And all of this has to do with the stereotypes of the feminine as being intuitive and receptive to nonlinear, non-logical, non-rational modes of communication. All of this, of course, is mainstream culture's way of demonizing any deviation from that norm. The attribution of monstrosity to queerness becomes part of this text's conservative position. And even though the text is radical in that it allows us to witness fantasies of departure from gender conventionality, we still see that at the end of the day, the text is really a conservative text because it settles on resolving all of these dissonances that it has just created. Renfield resonates with Dracula because he has lost his mind. This is another way to connect to Dracula other than through intuition and those sorts of conventional attributes attributed to the female. When you are insane, of course, your superego is either diminished or removed. And so in some ways, Renfield's lack of rationality, ostensible rationality, opens him up to Dracula's influence. So I'm going to cover a few things here. Three different ways to understand Renfield. The first is that he is the canary in the coal mine. That is a metaphor. Coal miners who are deep underground worry about loss of oxygen. And one of the problems in coal mining is that by the time you realize the oxygen supply is diminished, you are so weak and loopy that you can't do anything to save yourself. And so miners were notorious for bringing down into the mines with them a canary in a cage. And canaries, because their system is so much more sensitive to oxygen, will pass out or die when the oxygen starts to deplete in the environment. And so a dead canary in a cage tells a coal miner, we have a serious problem here, you need to get out. And so Renfield resonates with that sort of warning. He is his increased dependency on feeding animals in this food chain and becoming consumed with the idea of life taking life is a warning shot over the bow to the rest of the culture around him that Dracula is coming. But of course, nobody reads the signs. Secondly, which this sort of feeds into what I've been saying, Renfield is the psychic conduit of the id. So he becomes the channel through which Dracula's modus operandi for taking on more victims is expressed. And you can think of him as a mini-me, I guess, of Dracula. And so Renfield represents this tautology of Dracula. He is Dracula in miniature, and what we can say of Dracula we can kind of say of Renfield, except that Renfield doesn't have the power or the scope or the sinister personality that Dracula has. The other thing that's going on in this text very significantly is that Stoker is reworking a number of biblical myths. And he's doing it in a way that resonates with Mary Shelley's attempts to do the same thing in Frankenstein. So if you recall, Frankenstein reworks the Genesis story and the creation myth, making basically Victor a kind of inferior god who creates a creature that he cannot finish. Stoker is doing a similar thing in Dracula. And if you know your New Testament, John the Baptist is the harbinger of Christ. He is Christ's cousin. He travels through the Promised Land telling people that the Messiah is coming and baptizing them and preparing them for the arrival of Christ. Renfield has a John the Baptist role in the sense that he is trying to prepare both himself and the people around him for the coming of Christ, except that Dracula is not Christ. Dracula is an antichrist figure, and he wants people to follow him and to become like him, except of course he represents evil rather than good. And so I just might tweak this a little bit and say he's an inverted John the Baptist, by which I mean perverted or a sort of corrupted version of John the Baptist. So let's take a look at how this plays out in the text. I am at chapter 6. This is the 5th of June. It's Dr. Seward's diary. And you can see the dates here, the 5th of June, the 18th of June, the 1st of July, the 8th of July. So basically every 10 days to 2 weeks, Seward is writing a new entry as we watch Renfield's obsession with using life to feed life increase and increase and increase. So Seward starts by saying, the case of Renfield grows more interesting the more I get to understand the man. He has certain qualities very largely developed: selfishness, secrecy, and purpose. So in spite of Renfield's insanity, he is not without intention. I wish I could get at what is the object of his purpose. And so Seward is smart enough to understand that Renfield is being intentional about something, but he can't really understand it. That's because Renfield, as a man of science, is not receptive to the intuitive and telepathic messages that are coming from Dracula into the world of London. You either have to be feminine or insane so that your masculine, conventional masculine traits of rationality are suppressed. His redeeming quality is a love of animals, though indeed it is curious that I sometimes imagine he is only abnormally cruel. His pets are of all sorts. Just now his hobby is catching flies. At the present, such a quantity that I have had myself to expostulate. So he has to warn, Seward has to warn Renfield, you've got to stop with all these flies, worrying that it's going to cause Renfield to break out into a fury, which it doesn't. By the 18th of June, we see that Renfield has gone from flies to spiders because the spiders consume the flies. And so he is building his own kind of ecosystem with a predator higher up on the food chain each time. So when Seward returns a couple of weeks later, now Renfield has big spiders in a box. He keeps feeding them with his flies, and so the flies are decreasing, but of course the spider population is increasing, and so we see that here. It's a great little environmental ecosystem. His spiders are now becoming as great a nuisance as his flies, and today I told him that he must get rid of them. He looked very sad at this and said that he must clear out some of them at all events. He cheerfully acquiesced in this. We see this moment where there's a blowfly buzzing by, and he eats the whole thing live and raw. And so he's consuming life and decay all in the same moment. And he's perverted in the sense that consuming death or eating corpses, eating dead flesh is wholesome, rotting flesh, not just dead flesh. Then Seward clicks in, I must watch how he gets rid of his spiders. He has evidently some deep problem in his mind, for he keeps a little notebook in which he always is jotting down something. Well, everybody's writing something in this novel because it's an epistolary novel, but even Renfield has his notes. But it's just a bunch of numbers added up in batches, and so he's very empirical and numeric about this. Finally, by the 8th of July, Seward is onto something. There's a method in his madness, an unconscious celebration. So by the 19th of July, we are progressing. Now my friend has a whole colony of sparrows, and his flies and spiders are almost obliterated. And then he's got to have kittens to feed the sparrows to. So this increasing the hierarchy of predators on the food chain is a metaphor for Renfield growing in power. He is a miniature reenactment of Dracula, a fledgling Dracula, if you will, starting to build his own miniature kingdom. He is not a particular threat to Dracula, but it's interesting that this kind of mimics how all of this works. And so by the 19th of July, you know, he's begging for a cat. And this interesting word here, that his salvation depended upon it. So this whole thing about Dracula as the Antichrist is an inverted version of Scripture. And what we would understand on our side of the fence as damnation for following Dracula, Renfield sees it as salvation. We see here now that by the 20th of July, it has either escalated or degenerated, depending on how you want to view this, so much that Renfield is eating entire birds, feathers, and everything. So he has now become the top of the predator food chain. Seward calls him a homicidal maniac. I have to invent a new classification for them because there is no name for what Renfield is. Zoophagus, a life-eating maniac. What he desires is to absorb as many lives as he can. And this is Dracula. It's a consumptive appetite metaphor for consuming life. And this is what death does. Death consumes life and continues to consume life. So that's our first connection to Renfield. I want to move to chapter 12. And let's pull this up here. And, it is the report from Patrick Hennessy to John Seward, because while Seward is away from the asylum, he's left Patrick Hennessy in charge while Seward is off helping Van Helsing to get Lucy recovered. And there's an incident. This is, 20th of September, a report from Patrick Hennessy to Seward. With regard to the patient Renfield, there is more to say. He has had another outbreak which might have had a dreadful ending, so he keeps trying to escape. But which has fortunately happened was unattended by with any unhappy results. This afternoon's carrier cart with 2 men made a call to the empty house at the grounds about ours. The house to which you will remember the patient ran away twice. The men stopped at our gate, asked the porter their way as they were strangers. Renfield sees them and runs out into the street and has these violent fits of anger where he attacks these men for no reason. Before I could get up to him, the patient rushed at these men, pulling one of them off the cart, and began to knock his head against the ground. If I had not seized him, that is to say Renfield, just at that moment, I believe he would have killed the man then and there. The other fellow jumped down and struck him, Renfield, over the head with the butt end of his heavy whip. It was a terrible blow, but he, Renfield, did not seem to mind it. And so this is interesting, too, that Renfield is so psychotically focused on his object of violence that even when he's hit violently across the head, it doesn't stop him. He's in a berserker state of mind, a kind of trance where he can't be stopped, and it takes 3 men to restrain him. So he has this powerful strength that comes out of his madness, and this is what makes Renfield so particularly frightening. He is not a vampire, but he is a metaphor for the power that vampires have and for the strength that they have. And he's all about defending him. And this is the line I want to draw your attention to. I'll fight for my Lord and Master. And at the moment, Hennessy sees this as an incoherent raving. But now Renfield feels obliged to defend Dracula. And so he's already sympathetically connected with Dracula even before he has met Dracula. And this is very important because it speaks to predisposition. And it's something that we need to think about in this novel, because Lucy, because of her qualities, her traditional feminine qualities, and her subservience to men, seems more susceptible to Dracula's influence and suggestions than Mina, who is much more resistant. And Harker is also susceptible. So there's something about femininity that gives way or yields to Dracula's masculinity and his forcefulness. Renfield is in that camp as well. He is sympathetic with Dracula already, but unconsciously so. And I say that because at this point, I think Renfield has no superego. It's all unconsciousness that he's working on. He has no idea what he's doing or why he's doing it, but he is doing it. Then, a little further in chapter 19, I just want to highlight one line. It's right at the beginning of chapter 19. And it's a very unusual word that Van Helsing is talking about here. Seward is talking about. It says, I don't know, but that I agree with you. If that man had been an ordinary lunatic, I would have taken my chance of trusting him, but he seems to be mixed up with the Count in an indexy kind of way. And this word sent me scurrying to the OED. It does not exist in the OED, which is an interesting oversight, I think, actually, because it should appear in the OED. So I looked up index, and there's 2 meanings that might shed light on this. Index, first, to point to a fact or a conclusion. The idea being that your index finger is pointing to something. So Seward is saying that somehow, in some vague way that I can't pinpoint, Renfield is connected to Dracula, he points to Dracula, and that's why I suggested that Renfield is a kind of John the Baptist figure, because he is actually pointing to or indexing Dracula. The second meaning in the OED for index is to assign a token of something. A sign or token of something. So a representative or a symbol of. And so this is Seward now sort of articulating more consciously this relationship between Renfield and Dracula, that somehow they are, one is the other, or like the other, or is pointing to the other. Finally, I want to come down to chapter 21, and this is, I'll give you the citation for it. It's the 3rd of October, which is the beginning of the chapter, about 4 pages in. And I'm just going to find this now. So here it is. Renfield begins to whisper, "Rats, rats, hundreds, thousands, millions of rats, and every one a life, and dogs to eat them, and cats too, all lives, all red blood, with years of life in it, and not merely buzzing flies." So Renfield is ecstatic about accelerating this vampiric consumption of blood and life, and escalating it to a very high level. I laughed at him, for I wanted to see what he could do. Then the dogs howled away beyond the dark trees in this house. He beckoned me to the window. I got up and looked out. He raised his hands and seemed to call out with using any words. A dark mass spread over the grass, coming on like the shape of a flame of fire. Then he moved the mist to the right and left, which is a reference to, an allusion to, I think, the parting of the Red Sea when the Israelites leave the land of Pharaoh. And I could see that there were thousands of rats with their eyes blazing red, like his, only smaller. And this is why Dracula has this kind of ability to resonate with the animal world. He held up his hand and they all stopped, and I thought he seemed to be saying, Dracula doesn't say it, it's an intuition. "All these lies I will give you, I and many more and greater through countless ages, if you will fall down and worship me." And that is a clear allusion to the moment when Christ is fasting in the desert, and he is weak in body because he has not had water and food. And the devil appears to him with food and water to tempt him, and says, I will give you this relief from your physical discomfort if you will fall down and worship me. So it is a satanic invitation to worship the Antichrist, Dracula. And then a red cloud, like the color of blood, seemed to close over my eyes. And before I knew what I was doing, I found myself opening the sash and saying to him, "Come in, Lord and Master." This is a very unusual moment, because you have to invite the vampire in consciously and deliberately before the vampire can take control over you. But Renfield seems to have no innate resistance to the power of suggestion, the power of telepathic suggestion. It's true he does say it on his own, because Dracula never speaks to him. But it is interesting that Renfield seems to intuit that this is what Dracula is saying to him. And so the rats were all gone, but he slid in the room through this sash that was only an inch wide, just as the moon herself has often come through the tiniest crack and has stood before me in all her size and color. And so the penetration of Renfield's world, his asylum cell, comes to him because he involuntarily invites Dracula in. Remember when Harker appears at Castle Dracula, Dracula stands on the inside threshold of the door and waits and invites Harker in, but does not waits for Harker to step in before he does anything. That is the normal modus operandi. It's weird that Renfield is so susceptible to the Count that he becomes telepathically brainwashed to say, "Come in, Lord and Master." And so this is why I come back to this point about predisposition. Lucy and Renfield and Harker all seem predisposed to follow the Count. The more masculine characters, or masculine queer characters in the narrative, are more resistant to him. And so this is, metaphorically put, a relationship between the control associated with conventional masculinity and the subordination normally associated with traditional femininity.